All right.
Okay, we are live. I'll let you have at it.
All right. Hello, everyone. It is so awesome to see everyone. We have a wonderful panel planned for you all today. We are very excited about bringing this wonderful group of esteemed individuals together. I'm going to go ahead and get started with things. First, I wanted to introduce myself. I'm Dr. Lawrence Chatters, and all you should probably know about me is that I have two wonderful daughters, and those daughters are the light of my life, and they're 15 and 11. And the way that I see them growing up in this world, I'm really excited about, because I think as young women and young women of color, they have a lot of opportunities and they have great chance to be who they want to be. But there are also a lot of challenges for them. And we talk about those challenges on a weekly basis. And so today, in order to help create a world, in my opinion, that is a better world for them, we have some awesome panelists who are going to talk about how being white allies, they can help support this process of increasing social justice in our United States of America and around the world. And so let me tell you first a little bit about Fathering Together. Fathering Together is a nonprofit organization that is focusing on helping to build community and help fathers through supporting them by providing resources and also helping them increase their skill sets. And we also get the chance to hopefully empower fathers to tell their story. And in this particular vein, we're really excited to have this panel today. I am excited to talk about specifically the intros of these folks, because I think that, we have some really awesome people. So I might shoot my video off here. I'm going to talk about these wonderful people that we have on the panel, and I just want to read through some of their accomplishments. First of all, ladies and gentlemen, we have Dr. Molly Monahan Kreischman. Her pronouns are she and her. She is a writer, a trainer, a consultant, a coach, and the founder of Social Justice for Kids. Her signature course, Love Kids, attracts white parents and educators who want to engage in anti-racism efforts with kids, but find themselves saying, I don't know where to start, or I know I could do better. With 20 plus years of experience working on equity efforts within the educational system, paired with a master's and doctorate in educational administration and student development, Dr. Molly is uniquely situated to guide other white folks in deepening their capacity to create a better world with and for the kids they love. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome Dr. Molly. Next up on our panel, the wonderful gentleman with the books behind him. This is Dr. Keith Edwards. Dr. Keith Edwards, his pronouns are he and him, is a father, scholar of masculinities, and a speaker, consultant, and coach. Having worked with more than 200 organizations over the past 20 years, he has focused his attention on sexual assault prevention, men's identity, social justice education, curricular approaches, and leadership, with more recent research focused on anti-racist ally identity development. His scholarship interests include diversity and social justice education and college men's issues from a feminist and social justice perspective. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome Dr. Keith Edwards. And finally, Dr. Kyle C. Ashley. His pronouns are he and him. As a father, educator, and writer, he has been sharing his ideas about masculinity and social justice in education for over a decade in publications like The Good Men Project, Understanding and Dismantling Privilege, and the Journal of Critical Scholarship on Higher Education and Student Affairs. And more recently, he remains at home to care for his daughter while consulting on the side. And ladies and gentlemen, that is Dr. Kyle Ashley. So we are really extremely excited to have all of these wonderful people on this panel today. And we are going to go ahead and jump right into it. I'll talk to you a little bit about the format. We are going to be asking some questions of the panelists and give them an opportunity to share their thoughts. But first I'm actually going to throw a curveball out there for all of them. So the first question that I want to ask you all is, talk about what exactly allyship is, because people outside of the industry, maybe the scholarly side of things, don't really understand this concept of allyship. So who wants to kick it off and maybe answer that question of exactly what is allyship?
I'll take that. For me, I think about allyship, and this is not a consistent answer that everybody would agree on. But I think about allyship as those of us who benefit from the way the systems and structures are set up, benefit from the way society is, working to make the world more just and more equitable. And so, from my perspective, white people who are working to end systemic racism, men who are working to end sexism and patriarchy and transphobia, Christians who are working to end religious oppression, middle and upper class people who are working to end class oppression. Um, so I think it's a very interesting different dynamics when we experience oppression and we're working for change than when we experience privilege and we're working for change, and how we show up and how we navigate that and how we think about that and the challenges there. So that's how I would define allyship. Those of us with privilege that the system generally works for, working to make the system more equitable and more fair for everybody.
That's awesome. And so, Molly or Kyle, do you want to add anything else to that?
Well, I'll say I always love a question that brings up more questions for me. And when we talk about allyship, I like to think about, or I often think about, who gets to decide who is an ally, right? And I believe that it is not up to the sort of privileged folks in that dynamic to decide whether or not I'm worthy of that title. I need to show up. I need to show up humbly and continuously learning. And if folks decide, again, that I'm worthy of that title, then, you know, I am, then I'm worthy of that title. It reminds me of, you know, sort of decades ago when we had sort of allyship training on campuses, and you would get like a sticker that you could put on your door, like, I'm an ally. And students would be like, I don't think I'm an ally, you know? And so you'd have to wait and get the feedback first. It's another nuance for me on that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think I would echo both Molly and Keith's thoughts here. I mean, obviously, it's helpful to have an idea of what this idea is, but as a white person, for me, the more I get wrapped up in the idea of what allyship is and whether or not I am one and am I doing it right, I think oftentimes that leads to me actually not being an ally and making more mistakes and making more about me than actually taking action and supporting communities of color in the way that an ally should. And so I actually think about it like the same as like whether or not someone is funny, right? So if someone is funny, they don't go around saying, hey, I'm really funny, you know? And in fact, if somebody does that, it's usually a good cue that they're probably not very funny. And they're gonna be annoying, and you're probably gonna get sick of them being around, trying to tell you jokes and make you laugh. But somebody is funny because they make you laugh, and they do things that make you laugh, and they do things that are funny. And so I think for me that's just a good framework because it helps you to understand that it's not about a title, it's not about achieving some badge or sticker that you can put on the door. It's about what you do, and it's about you know, action and doing the things that the people that you're trying to be in service to they think is helpful, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so those are all amazing points, and I really apologize. I am a psychologist by training, and so there may be some reframing and also some potential reflection here that I do in between questions. But what I hear you all saying is that to be an ally is to be recognized by people in that community as a person who stands alongside them in solidarity through your actions, not necessarily a sticker or just a particular reason that you said, hey, this is who I am, but it is truly through your behavior or can essentially become an ally. It is not something that is just bestowed upon you. It is something that is acted on through and through, and something that you constantly are engaging in. It's not something you accomplish and then look at it on the wall, right? So that's really a neat perspective on that. And Keith, especially what you were saying, that there's a number of different types of allyship across different groups, and where you have that privilege and you have the opportunity to support those marginalized groups, that is where that allyship is needed most. And so to kind of turn the conversation in that direction, right now, clearly, Within the United States, I think there are some people who are becoming more aware of the inequities regarding and surrounding racial justice specifically. And so I think for a lot of people who have been doing this work for a long time, they've recognized that these things have persisted and just been a part of our culture for such a long time, right? But some people are starting to see this and they're starting to move and they're starting to be finally compelled. Can you talk just a little bit, and I'm going to shoot this question over to Molly. Can you talk about how parents, white parents specifically, can educate themselves and also their children about some of the things that are happening right now, this potential awakening that's been going on?
Absolutely. Well, I think one of the most important pieces to keep in mind in terms of working with kids on racial justice is understanding where they're coming from developmentally and sort of meeting them where they're at. So we talk a lot in social justice kids about sort of ages and stages of racial development. And I don't know about anyone else, but I was shocked when I first learned that by 3 months old, infants are gazing longer at faces that match the race of their caregivers. And at 6 months old, infants are not verbally grouping people. You know, by age 2.5, age 3 to 5, kids are choosing their play groups by race. And so I think that there's this misunderstanding around racialized colorblindness when it comes to kids, and understanding that we really need to be very active in our conversation. So I think that's why people are showing up now, but I also think not everyone knows those developmental milestones in terms of how our kids are showing up and understanding. So I always like to go, all the way back to birth, right? And talk about like laying the foundation of language. We see as adults that we get tripped up with language all the time, particularly as white people. Like, do we say black? Do we say African American? What words do we use? We're always worried we're going to say the wrong word. If we start very young, laying the foundation for language, then that language development is just natural. So I will say anyone who's seen me do workshops know that I have my stack of children's literature to sort of illustrate. So one of our favorites right now is Anti-Racist Baby by Ibram X. Kendi. It just came out, and I'm pretty sure you cannot find a copy anywhere. But just to say, like, when we are talking about books and reading books with our kids, that we can say, we can name color. He has skin that is dark brown, and he might identify as black or African American. We don't know until we ask him, but that might be, or this family looks like maybe they could identify as Asian. We don't know until we ask them, but even just using some of that language to sort of lay that foundation for kids is huge. And then I think the other thing that I will add in terms of talking about racial justice is the idea of fairness. So kids get fairness so easily, right? Kids are sort of hardwired for fairness. And so when we can couch some of these conversations in terms of fairness, that some people get more and some people get less, or, are simply based on the color of their skin. And this is something that has been happening in our country for hundreds of years. That activating that sense of unfairness in our kids really helps activate their engagement in doing something about it. So I'll share those two pieces. I'll stop there. I could go on and on.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think that to show the resource of a book that folks can get is awesome. And I hope that Brian Anderson, who's on the call, and Christopher Lewis, our founders of Dads with Daughters and Fathering Together, can share some of these resources in the comments as well if folks are interested. But as you mentioned, just starting early and talking about these things often and creating a sense of comfort around these discussions and this inquisitiveness about how to do things more correctly or to understand these concepts more deeply. And as a parent, we know that the things that we talk with our kids about, they do become more comfortable with. And so even if it's a subject that unfortunately in our country has been seen as taboo, which is also basically existed as a way to maintain supremacy, right? Is that, oh, there's no reason to talk about fairness in our country, right? But if we become comfortable with these things, talking with our children about these things, it helps out a lot. So truly appreciate you sharing that perspective. Keith, do you have anything to add at all to this perspective that Molly has shared about starting early, understanding the developmental stages where young people are and how to talk about this? I think you may be on mute, possibly.
I don't have audio for Keith.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't.
Sorry, I was on.
There we go. Awesome. Okay.
I want to see Molly's whole stack of books. I'm just dying with curiosity what else is in there.
Yeah.
But maybe we'll get to that later.
They're not. I mean, they're all over the house. We see them behind in the hallway. They're downstairs. But yeah, there's a bunch here too.
Yeah. Well, what that tells
awesome.
you is that Molly just doesn't talk about being a socially just parent. She's busy doing it all over the house.
Yeah.
I think what I want to add is what I constantly find is when these questions come up for me as a father, I get tense. I make it complicated. I think, oh my goodness, how am I going to explain Black Lives Matter, police brutality, systems of racism, 400 years, and I'm going to explain this to a 6-year-old.
Yeah.
And then when I have to explain it to a 6-year-old, it's not complicated. Black Lives Matter says that Black people's lives matter. Some people, well, don't they? Well, they do, but they don't always get treated that way. Like what? Well, some Black people are being killed by the police for things that they shouldn't be killed for. Really? Yeah. Still? Yeah. Even after Martin Luther King? Yeah. Why don't we have a sign? Here we go. Like, when you have to explain it to a little kid, it's a reminder to me that these dynamics are not complicated. All the nonsense I've been taught my whole life makes it complicated for me. And so I love Molly's suggestion about fairness. And my kid, we recently watched something about people being treated unfairly along the lines of racism in a very minor way. And my 10-year-old is crying. She's like, what? Still? And like, she's emotionally devastated by the unfairness that she's seeing. And so just to cultivate that, I think is really important. So
Thank you so much for sharing that, Keith. And you bring up some excellent points, which is that I think to a certain extent, we do complicate those things talking with our children. And just to share something quick, I also feel that same unfortunate draw toward this complication of, and also a certain amount of anger with when my daughters are consistently bringing up things that are happening to them in their school. It angers me first, but then I also understand that they just want to come to me to talk about it and reason through why they're being treated a certain way. And as much as I want to send them away with a sense of strength and power, like, you go back and you can deal with this and you'll be okay, there's also a certain amount of anger that I have about the fact that the world is still this way and that they are going to have to face these things for the rest of their life. And these are just some initial conversations that will persist. And so I would just hope, and what I often wonder in those discussions with my daughters is, what are the other people who are doing this, what are their parents saying to them at home? And I think that if their parents at home can be individuals just like the three of you on this call, where you are constantly pushing back against that, then I think my daughters may need to come home less and have those conversations with me and my partner, And so that's so awesome about this call to me, is that this panel is just that these are the people who are in the other spaces doing the work, so I don't have to do all the work and patch my daughters up to go back out and get beat up again, right? So thank you so much for sharing that. Kyle, did you have anything else to share about that particular perspective of talking to our kids from a young age about these different issues?
Yeah, so I think for me it always comes back to focusing on ourselves first. And sort of to echo, some of what Keith and Molly both shared, I think talking with kids about this is both complicated and easy at the same time. And it's complicated because especially we as white folks, we don't have experience talking about race and racism. We spend most of our lives not talking about this. So we don't have the language, we don't have the words. So how can we try and explain it, and unpack these really big, complicated ideas, like Keith said, that we've sort of been socialized our whole lives to understand in very implicit ways, if we don't have the language to do that, especially for somebody who doesn't have those big words and big ideas. And so then at the same time, I think it's very easy because we can just think of ourselves as children in this conversation. Just like our kids, we don't really have a lot of experience talking about this. They don't have a lot of experience talking about this. So instead of us being sort of the keepers of knowledge about race and racism, as white folks, we can enter into a conversation about race with our kids more or less at the same place and say, let's learn about this together, because we have about the same understanding. And so, I think that's hard for white folks because we're conditioned to believe that it's not okay to not know the answer. And especially in parenting, that's hard to not know the answer. But I think if we're willing to say, I don't know, and I want to learn, that is an incredible role model for our kids to say, it's okay not to know things, and it's okay to want to learn and to want to, acquire the knowledge. And so there are lots of great resources out there. Molly shared a few books. I know PBS recently did a collaboration with Sesame Street after the murder of George Floyd. Really incredible. So it really just takes a Google search, and there's tons of resources out there. And like I said, I think it comes back to us and acknowledging that we don't have all the answers, and that's okay.
Can I add
Yeah,
something?
so please, yes.
So I love that. And I love the idea of starting with us, right? Like this work starts from the inside out and sort of unpacking how much we don't know. And I love that idea of getting into like a child curiosity level about this as a grown up. I think one of the things that makes me think about too is this way in which whiteness is sort of everything and nothing at once. And so we don't talk about whiteness. And so you even saw me just model that. Like I brought up this book and I talked about races or racial identities that were different than mine, and I skipped right over mine, right? And so that right there is like a moment of self-awareness. We really need to be talking about whiteness with if we have white kids, right? And that's not always right across the board for white parents, but if we have white kids, we really need to be disrupting the idea of whiteness. Actually, I should say, if we are white adults, no matter what racial identities our kids are, we need to be troubling over our whiteness. And so that does also mean that we need to have the language to name that, right? So like I have peachy skin, that is sometimes called white. That is an identity that shows up in the world in certain ways. I get unfair benefits, I get unfair extras because of the color of my skin. And so I need to make sure I don't take advantage of that. And we can talk about that, like, if there's a cake and I take 2 slices of cake and nobody, that means somebody doesn't get a slice of cake. Like, what? I mean, there are ways that again, as Keith was saying and modeling, great ways to sort of chunk that down for kids. And then I love how that then helps inform us on how we think about it too. Taking it down to that childhood wonder helps us expand our own thinking.
Yeah, and so I truly appreciate you recognizing that in the moment, Molly, that, just not necessarily bringing that concept into it, but to model that is awesome. I think that as parents, sometimes we want to feel like we have things figured out so that we can tell our kids how to solve the problem, right? We want to be that problem solver who can lead them out of the struggle area that they're in and then lead them to a place where they can be successful, because oftentimes that's how we're socialized. But I do agree that struggling in the moment with your child um, can often be so much more liberating when you can both find the answer together. And I think that's a beautiful thing. And I think that we have to be willing and open to this idea that we also need to continue to do that work ourselves. And so it kind of leads to this next question. And I want to pose this question to Keith. And so, Keith, this one's coming right at you. Okay. So here we are talking about these concepts that are very difficult concepts in our society by virtue of, some of the things we've talked about, historical context, and the fact that not talking about these things has maintained power for certain groups of people. We know that we have all of these people in our friend groups where they're like, you know what? I just don't get it. Like white privilege, like I worked so hard in my life. Like you can't tell me this. I grew up poor. I didn't have anything. How are you telling me now that I have privilege, right? Keith, can you just talk to us a little bit and maybe start off this conversation about how do you have these conversations with other parents who may not necessarily understand these concepts? Give us some, I guess, tools and on how you can start these conversations with people who aren't as open to this idea that there is some sense of white privilege.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I constantly think about is um, people who disagree with me, who want to engage, I will talk with them ad nauseum. But some people don't want to engage. They just want to fight. And I just don't want to do that. Because if you want to fight and I fight, then you don't move. In fact, you hunker down, right? I mean, I do. um, and I also found just in my teaching that when I tell students racism exists, they'll argue with me about it. When I tell students that they have privilege, they'll argue with me about it. But when I say racism is systemic, and if we think about it as happening as individuals, institutions, and in society, what are some examples? They'll give me a ton of examples. If I say, so privileges, as Molly said, are things that we get that we didn't earn and don't deserve, or things that we don't get that we didn't earn and don't deserve. What are some privileges? They'll give me tons of examples. And so that would be my approach with people who say, maybe racism is over, we're done with that. I would say, do you see any examples of racism happening now? Or what are those? And I bet they'll come up with some. People who say, I grew up poor, I'm not privileged. I grew up poor, but I still was white. And that made being poor a little bit easier than other folks. And so we can have privilege in one place and not in another. And one of the things that I'm really experimenting with in my conversations and in my own thinking is I think when we talk about Keith is privileged, that's really essentializing. That's not who I am. That's not about anything that's internalized to me. But I experience privilege based on the way the world is set up around my race. And I experience oppression based on other ways the world is set up. But I am not oppressed. I am not privileged. I experience both of those things. And I think that's helpful in locating the issue with the way the world is designed, not with me. And the more I can dismantle some of the ways that I get privilege, the world actually gets better for me. My humanity gets better, my relationships get better, my community gets better, my kids' school gets better, the social welfare of my community. I live here in Minneapolis. Racism is really messing up my life as a white person right now. Racism toward people of color is really affecting my life in a negative way as a white person. And so when we can tap into that enlightened self-interest, that racism is also diminishing our lives as white people, my kids' lives, I think we enter it into a very different way.
Thank you for sharing that, and thank you for making that distinction of using examples and giving other people the opportunity to see and point things out so that they can, through pointing those things out, recognize that those things do exist, and then taking it off of the personal level, lifting that responsibility off of a person specifically to say you are, as opposed to you experience. I think that's really important because I don't think anyone wants to plug into this idea that this white supremacy has lasted for so long and that they are in charge of continuing it. Nobody wants to tie into that. But if they understand how history has created our country this way, and we can point back at so many different examples and we can look at so many statistics and an understanding of that, and they recognize that this is just the way that things have been, and we can actually serve to dismantle that rather than to continue it, then I think they see their agency in that process. And so I really appreciate you sharing that perspective, especially that it seems like you've had these conversations with people around you. And sometimes you're right. Some people come to engage, other people come to fight, and it's a very different process. Kyle, I wanted to turn this over to you. What is it like for you to hear Keith talk about some of those things, and maybe coming from a space where you've possibly had some of these conversations as well? How do you relate to what he said?
Yeah, so I agree with a lot of what Keith shared. I think for me, as soon as I start to think about this conversation as being divisive or as being a fight, I start to prepare for that fight, right? I start to put on my armor, I put on my, my game face, and that changes how I engage in the conversation. And so I think for me, it's about trying to unlearn this idea that there are good white people and bad white people, that there are some white people who get it, and there are some white people who don't get it, and there are some white people who are just the bad ones. I think that is just an unhelpful distinction, and it divides us and distracts us from actually doing the work that we need to do together. I think the reality is we're all complicit in racism as white people. We've been socialized in a system of whiteness and white supremacy, and whether knowing or unknowing, we all perpetuate racism from time to time. And so as soon as we can acknowledge that and get over that, stop trying to be afraid of being called a racist, or getting over this idea that you're a good one, that you're the white savior, that you're going to save the day. As soon as we can get over all of that ego-driven stuff, then we can actually start to have a real conversation about how we can work together to make this world a better place. And I think Keith's example about thinking in terms of the ways in which racism affects us as white people. So I mentioned a culture of whiteness and white supremacy. This culture trains us to not see racism, right? And so even though we benefit greatly from a system of white supremacy, it also causes us harm. And so one of the things that I like to talk to other white people about is, how does the topic of racism make you feel? Just be honest. What are some of the emotions that come up when you think about the idea of racism? And regardless of where you stand on any particular issue related to race, more than likely those emotions are going to be negative. They're going to be anger, frustration, defensiveness, things that make you feel bad. Well, that's a great place that we can all start from. Racism makes us feel crappy. And so if racism makes us all feel bad, then let's work together to do something about it.
And so, Molly, I wanted you to specifically address a question, a comment that came through our chat. And that is essentially that someone is saying that, saying white privilege is a thing, saying that in some ways white people are treated better than people of color is racist in and of itself. Can you address that concept and just that, I guess, that belief that a lot of people would have is just by maybe thinking or believing that they have white privilege, that they are in that racist themselves by thinking that?
Oh my God, that's such a big question. So let's see. So I want to make sure that I'm understanding how the question is being posed. That simply by being white, we are racist. Is that the thing that we want to unpack?
So I think the way that I would propose it is this: is that by acknowledging that by being white that you have privilege over people of color is in essence being racist because you're believing that because you're white you have certain privileges. Now, what I would add as an addition to that is that racism is real. It's not a construct that is some kind of invisible thing. It is something that has implications on a daily basis, right? So, first of all, I think recognizing that racism is real is important. But can you kind of talk a little bit about how this idea of potentially engaging in this thought process that people have white privilege can be recognition of that racism and how that's an important part of the process? I guess it is an important part of the process, I believe. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So we at Social Justice Kids, we talk a lot about the idea of racialized color blindness and how when we sort of gloss over the existence of race and racism, then it sort of robs us of the ability to do something about it, right? And so I think it's sort of the opposite. If I'm understanding you correctly, or understand the question that was posed correctly, um, you know, talking about it, naming it, is really the only way to address it, as opposed to sort of like, um, talking about race is not racist. Talking about race is anti-racist because you're disrupting this sort of like status quo around um, how things are right now, right? So I'm having so many thoughts on a lot of different levels right now. I'm going to toss this ball to one of my friends and then I'm going to circle back because there's so many things that I want to say about this that I'm having a hard time like pulling them out.
So,
I can jump in.
Keith, yes, I was going to ask you
Yeah,
to jump in there.
I think acknowledging that white people have advantages we didn't earn and don't deserve, and that some people have disadvantages they didn't earn and don't deserve, is just acknowledging reality. And that reality can be uncomfortable because I would like to think that all the things that I've gotten in my life, I've earned. And I have. I've earned a lot of them. And some of them I got, or some of them are obstacles that other people had that I didn't have because I'm white and because of how the system is set up. And that can be uncomfortable to acknowledge. But acknowledging those dynamics doesn't create them. That would be like saying, if we don't talk about poverty, there won't be poor people, right? Like that's not how that works. And so how can we recognize what is going on, what is happening, and not feel, as Kyle was mentioning, not feel that I'm a bad person because of that, but just acknowledging that that's real. And what do I want to do to change that so that the world is a more fair place for everybody? And if the world was a more fair place for everybody, it would be better for all of us. And so I think talking about white privilege is just acknowledging what is really going on, and not talking about race, which is super tempting as a parent. My kids are in a very diverse school environment, and talking about race brings up differences and challenges and who plays with who and who doesn't and the assumptions they make. And it's really uncomfortable for me. But I'm reminded that when I have those conversations, the real reason it's uncomfortable for me to talk about racism with my kids is because I'm afraid my own racism is going to show up. And I'm afraid how I explain it to them will reinforce my own racism that I've learned my whole life, that I work really hard to unlearn, is going to show up, and I will say something to them and they will take it and they will repeat it at school and someone will say that's racist and I will be ashamed. And it really, the root that what makes us uncomfortable in talking about racism is a fear of my own racism. And when you can recognize that and lean into it, and as Kyle said, a transformative moment for me was just acknowledging, of course I have racist thoughts and of course I've done racist things. I'm 44 years old. I've been taught my whole life those things. And so, oh, well, now I can unpack it. But if you don't unpack it, it's still there. It's just messing with you from the back of your head in ways that you don't understand. And I don't like being a puppet. So I would rather wrestle with it and see it and navigate it. And for me, as soon as I think I'm done, I just have to drive somewhere. Inevitably, someone ahead of me will irritate me. I'll go past them. I'll do that little quick glance. And in less than a second, my brain would fill in a whole story about that person. Right? If they're old, it fills in a story. If they're Asian, it fills in a story. If they're a young woman, it fills in a story. And those are all my implicit biases and prejudices that are human and inevitable. But how do we recognize what those are and unpack them so that we can be more real and really interact with other people rather than the stories our brains are creating about those people based on the messed up information we've received?
So one thing, and thank you very much for sharing. And Molly, I apologize for putting you on the spot in that question. It's a deep question, and I appreciate your candor to just talk from your heart on that. And Keith, you as well, and Kyle, the things you all have been sharing have been really eye-opening. One piece that I want to add here is just that I truly do believe that there are some people who have the opportunity to live in spaces where there are multiple cultures that are consistently coming together and celebrating with each other and everything else, right? There's definitely those spaces in our country. As you mentioned, Keith, our kids, may go to schools that are very diverse and everything. None of that actually changes the history of the United States, right? None of that changes where we've come from and how we've gotten to where we are. And so therefore, this is always going to be, in our lifetimes, a significant challenge to overcome simply because of where we've come from as a country. So I do want people to understand that no one here is saying that you don't live your life trying to be very close with other people. You don't have friends or family members that are different cultures, but we have to think about who does not benefit when we don't talk about race, right? And I think that when we don't talk about race, there are certain people, even our friends, our family members, who match this cultural difference, who unfortunately continue to be oppressed by us not talking about these things. And so, as you said, Keith, it would be great to not have to talk about it and just pretend like it's something that hasn't happened or doesn't happen or we don't have to address. But there are people who unfortunately suffer as a result of that. And so I think if we seek to create a more just world where people don't have to suffer, then we do have to talk about poverty. We do have to talk about, the achievement gap, these different things that are real. They're not fake. They're not concepts. These are real things that have an impact on people's lives. And so therein lies that benefit of talking about this and stretching ourselves a little bit. It's not easy. It's not fun, but there are, as you said, Keith, everybody benefits when we have these discussions and we try to create a more just and fair world. And I think that if, people struggle with understanding those concepts, therein lies the definition of what privilege is, right? So Kyle, I did want to give you a chance. This last question I'm going to toss to you, and that is just, how can we encourage people out there, whoever they happen to be, that are specifically white people, how can we encourage them to be supportive of the Black Lives Matter movement? This is something that, of course, of late has been, very much in the forefront of the news and such. And there's a lot of people who have complicated feelings about it. Can you talk about why people have complicated feelings about Black Lives Matter? Not necessarily yourself, but maybe the way you see it and how they can be supportive in that journey.
Yeah. So I think part of the reason why folks struggle with the Black Lives Matter movement, from what I understand, and I'll just talk from my own experience, to pretend like I'm separate from other people in this is just not true. And so I've had some of the similar kinds of ideas and thoughts that a lot of people have around, wait a minute, what's this all about and what does this mean? So it's a really important question. And you know, I think in terms of wanting to support people of color, once we realize that the Black Lives Matter movement is important, that you know, as Molly and Keith both said, you know, yes, Black Lives Matter, and in the current culture that we live in, that isn't the case. That's not true, and Black people continue to be devalued, and their lives aren't treated with the same dignity and respect as other folks. And so once we get to that point, one of the biggest things that I can say for myself that I continue to practice on a daily basis is listening to Black people. It's really pretty much as simple as that. My wife is a person of color, and a long time ago we were having a conversation about race, and I was trying to say, listen, I understand that you feel passionately about this, but aren't you just overreacting? Aren't you just being a little too sensitive about this? And she said, Kyle, what would it mean if you just believed me? What would it mean if you could just hear what I'm saying and believe me? What does it cost you to believe what I'm saying? And in that moment, I realized, you know what? It doesn't cost me anything. It doesn't cost me anything to put my own ego aside and say, okay, her experience is different than mine. I might not necessarily understand what she's talking about or even agree with it, but that doesn't mean she's wrong. And in fact, from her perspective, it's true. What she has experienced in her life is true. And I care so deeply about her. What would it mean if I just believed what she was telling me? Could I put all of the stories about what matters and what doesn't matter, could I put those things aside and just believe her? And I think the same can be said about Black Lives Matter. And how we can support Black people. Black people have been telling us about racism for over 400 years. And, I think as a country, we are finally starting to listen. We're finally starting to pay attention, because how can we not? The evidence is just so overwhelming. And, for some people, that means having to watch videos of people being murdered in broad daylight. For other people, we don't need to watch those videos. We know that these things happen and these things are real. And so I had a conversation with a good friend of mine who is Black, and she said, what would happen if, and I asked her, what would happen if, as a Black person, you gave feedback to white people who either said something or did something that was racist. They instead of getting defensive or fragile, they received that feedback with grace. They listened to that feedback. They reflected on it, reflected on their behavior, and then they sought to change it. Those three simple things: receiving the feedback, reflecting on the feedback, and then trying to change the behavior. And my friend said, that would be revolutionary. That would literally change the world if white people started to do that. And so I think in terms of supporting the Black Lives Matter movement as white people, I think literally the first thing we should and need to do is just start listening to Black people.
There's so many powerful things you shared there, Kyle, and I truly appreciate you just being very vulnerable in this moment and talking about this experience with your partner, and her saying, what does it cost you to believe what I have to say? And that is such there's beauty in that statement, because it is a representation of privilege to feel as though someone's taking something from you just to try to get them to understand and acknowledge that you're experiencing something, right? That's a privilege. And I think that we can learn so much from that concept of allowing people to be in their space and not losing anything in that process. I also feel that this last point that you've made about, being in a position where you can reflect, you can receive, and then also just change that behavior is so important, because I think that's something we can all learn from. And I think in a lot of our trainings, you understand that when you get feedback that is constructive, you have to receive it first, right? You have to acknowledge, you know what, I can acknowledge that this is something that I did. And then you have to reflect and say, how can I maybe make some changes? And then making the change to that behavior is then what makes that interaction so important, that constructive feedback. So I truly appreciate you sharing sharing those perspectives. Molly, do you have anything to add to this? I saw that you were really engaged and wanted to just maybe offer you some time to talk about how potentially you have helped with this movement of Black Lives Matter, how you've been able to discuss this with some of your friends who may not understand it. And then we'll go to Keith on that last point, and then we'll start to wrap things up.
Sure. Well, so I think one of the things that kind of came up for me as Kyle was speaking, with this sense of sort of how we as white people often want the message to be delivered in a certain way. We want for folks to sort of like, if it's not being delivered perfectly in a way that we want to receive it, we will critique the way it has been delivered as opposed to hearing the content of the message. And so that's the other thing that I think comes up for me in terms of, I love the idea of when we get feedback, particularly from folks of color, folks with other marginalized and minoritized identities, receiving that as a gift. I think it's not, we're not always seen as folks who are worthy of that time and energy. And so if we have been deemed worthy of that time and energy, we need to do something with that. And then that piece about how it's delivered doesn't matter, actually it matters even more how it is delivered. It's an added layer for us to understand what's really there, the passion behind the message, right? So if it comes toward us with anger, if it comes toward us with tears, and we might need another whole session to unpack white women's tears or white men's anger, right? That might be another session we can do another day. But we need to sort of, when those messages are coming toward us from folks of color, folks with marginalized, minoritized identities, instead of blocking the message because we don't like the anger, or we don't like the passion, or we don't like, just receive it with that piece as an added layer of understanding how much is going on in the delivery of that. And so that's a really big piece for me. In terms of, so I have two other thoughts. One, I do this weekly story time, social justice kids story time on a Facebook page, and called Too Cool for School. And the last 3 or so weeks, we typically just do stories that, feature characters, kids with diverse identities that maybe aren't seen as frequently in children's literature, right? And so, but in the last 3 weeks or so, we've really centered like activism and racial justice. And 2 weeks ago, we did this book, Something Happened in Our Town. And this is another really powerful one for talking to kids about racial justice and Black Lives Matter. And my 4-year-old on Facebook Live in front of potentially 25,000 people. They probably weren't all there at that particular time. But she said, we should kill the police. And so what do we do in those moments where our kids say, the most anxiety provoking things sort of publicly, right? And I think there is this sense that we as white folks have to do what we call in social justice kids the shush and run, right? We just don't want to deal with it. We're just going to like quiet the child and run away, right? And we need to get quiet in that moment and receive what they're saying and engage deeply, right? In the moment. because when we shush and run, we are teaching them that we don't talk about this stuff, right? We are essentially silencing the conversation for the rest of their lives. And so we must create environments where they can say the thing that is on their mind, and we can really sit with them in those moments. And so we were able to, in front of however many people were watching at the moment, say, no, we do not meet violence with violence. That is not what we do. How else can we engage in changing things other than violence, right? And so we're able to, and so I'll share yet another great one for talking to kids. Let's see where it is here. Why are they kneeling? This has great examples all the way through the back of how kids can engage in racial justice. So they talk about, he's kneeling but by making signs. He's kneeling by writing letters, right? And so all of these things layer on top of that too. But folks of color, folks with marginalized and minoritized identities right now are angry, and that is coming out sometimes in violent ways right now because we, people who look like us with white skin, peachy skin, we haven't been listening for hundreds of years. And what would that feel like? How would you respond if mommy didn't listen to you for days and days and days? Like, mommy, I need this thing. I need this thing. I just was not listening and was not interested in meeting that need. Would that make you very angry? Would that bring you wrong? Right? And so we also are not judging folks for however that is showing up right now. But for us, we are not meeting violence with violence. That's not something that we're doing. But we're also understanding that there's a wide range and good reason for why other people are showing up with lots of. So, and I will say that the other thing we talk about in social justice kids is this idea of the circle back, right? That the beauty of parenting is that it's not done today, right? The conversation happens tomorrow too. And so if we're stumped to earlier points about we're always in conversation, we're always learning with our children, right? We can always come back and say, when we talked about this yesterday, we talked about this and that, and then I had another idea. And what do you think about this? Or I about this in the meantime, or maybe we can together learn about this other thing, right? And so it doesn't need to be perfect, but in the moment, there are ways in which we can stay in it, right? And that was the important thing about that particular moment in front of all of those people for me, but also in those quiet moments in our own house where no one's watching, do it too.
That's awesome. Well, unfortunately, we are about out of time at this point. I want to, first of all, very personally thank all of the panelists on our call today. Keith, Kyle, Molly, you all have just been very open and honest and vulnerable. And I think that I believe that many people have been able to learn and hopefully will be able to see your words and engage in this and understand better what they need to do to become better allies. I did want to make a quick plug here for Fathering Together. Next week, we'll be hosting another panel with members of the Facebook community. And essentially, it's called Contextualizing This Moment. And so how a conversation on race and friendship can help us to discuss more how we can bring up some of these things with our friends, especially across cultural lines. So join us next week for that. It'll be on Wednesday at around the same time. And then finally, if you really enjoyed today's webinar, we invite you to check out our Fatherhood Insider. The Fatherhood Insider is the essential resource for any dad that wants to be at their best. And the Fatherhood Insider is full of awesome, valuable resources and information that will up your game and as a father. And through our extensive course library, our interactive forums, and step-by-step roadmaps, you'll get a chance to engage with experts and some of the folks on this call as well, which is great. Make sure you check that out by going to fatheringtogether.org and clicking on Join Now. Again, thank you so much for all of our panelists today. It's been awesome to serve on this panel with you all and just hear your experiences, and truly absolutely appreciative of all the work that you all are doing out there as scholars, as parents, as allies, and it's been a blessing to have this opportunity to speak with you all today. So thank you for all of our folks out there in our Fathering Together community for tuning in today, and make sure you share this and can benefit from this. Thank you.
Thank you for leading us, Lawrence.
Having us.